Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have you back. My name is Jeff Pelly with IU17, and we are back at it again with our IEP Best Practice Series, this time focusing on all things alignment. So if this is your first time here, I want to invite you to check out some other links that we have. There was a session on present levels. There was also a session on measurable annual goals, and we also had a session on transition. These sessions don't necessarily build upon one another, so you can check one out. You don't have to do them in any kind of sequence there, but they're there for you. Again, present levels, measurable annual goals, and transition. So we're very happy to have you here. And we're going to talk all things alignment today, as I said. And alignment really has to do with whatever the student needs. And those needs are determined through awesome present levels. We really have to make sure that we do a great job with our present levels. And those present levels also turn into needs that we represent in the transition grid if that student is age 14 or older. And those needs also get turned into either a measurable annual goal, specially designed instruction, or a related service. So we have to make sure that everything is aligned. The needs drive all of these things here. And those are our objectives today, to make sure that we talk about those. So just a quick review. We like to do this at every IEP Best Practice Series here. So we all know that the IEP is that legally binding written document that outlines the specially designed instruction that each student is going to get within 1 year's time. We like to say it's that contract between the school district and the parents to ensure that that kiddo is going to get proper special education services. We review it once a year, but could also be reviewed anytime either party, the school district or the family, would like to review it. The IEP sections are all here. Again, we already went over our present levels. We went over transition services. We went over goals and objectives. And now we're going to go over how all of these sections here fit together with proper alignment. So going back over our present levels, this is really what I like to say the meat and potatoes of the actual IEP. It describes and summarizes the student's performance in their current educational program, as well as their instructional and functional skills. It is that starting point, the basis for writing those measurable annual goals. And if a student is of transition age, we go into detail about those. The present levels must include academic achievement, functional performance, those present levels for transition if the student is 14 or older, any type of parent concerns that the parents might have, and how that student's disability is going to impact them in both the general education environment and also the curriculum. We also want to talk about strengths, and then very, very important down here, always talking about what our needs are. Those present levels are going to set up what the child actually needs. Furthermore, strengths, what does the kiddo do well? And again, we just talked about needs a moment ago. The needs are based on those annual present levels. The needs are going to drive the measurable annual goals. And we always want to make sure we have a starting point with our measurable annual goals. We have to know where the student was starting from, and we call that a baseline. As a general rule of thumb, the number of needs should always match the number of measurable goals. If you have 3 needs, say reading, writing, and math, you're going to have 3 measurable annual goals in reading, writing, and math as well. So the measurable annual goals here are designed to meet the student's individual needs resulting from their disability. Again, it's based on those needs from the present levels. The annual goals are a description of what a reasonable expectation can be, and it's something that we want the child to be able to do in 1 year's time. We can have short-term objectives. If the student takes the alternate assessment, the PASA, we have to have short-term objectives, or the team can decide, you know what, we want to make sure we have a roadmap for meeting these annual goals in the form of a short-term objective. Measurable annual goals build the skills identified in the needs section. We should prioritize these. We shouldn't have 10 to 12 goals. We should only have 3 to 5, if that. We want to make sure that we have an expectation of where the student will be at the end of the year of instruction. And again, that baseline piece, very, very important. We always want to start with a baseline. So also we can always talk about transition if the student is age 14 or older, and transition is also in effect if that student is 13, but within 1 year's time, they're going to turn 14. You would still want to be able to do that there. So if the student is turning 14 within that IEP, we do need to take a look at transition. Transition has to be updated annually. It has to be based on age-appropriate transition assessments. We always want to make sure that we have the current year's assessment and go back at least 1 year to get a background information on what the assessment said last year as well. And we also want to make sure we have agencies involved with our IEP if the student is of transition age. Sometimes we like to say agency involvement as a separate bullet there. And then we want to make sure that we have our 3 post-secondary goals: education and training, employment, and independent living. Those are the 3 areas that we focus on in transition. We also want to make sure that we look at our courses of study, our services, and our activities. And these are all things that occur in the transition grid. This is an example of a completed transition grid for post-secondary education and training. We always want to make sure that we have this box checked as a yes if we're going to have a post-secondary goal. And our goals should always occur post, meaning after high school graduation. So a statement like upon high school graduation or after high school graduation. Then we need to make sure that we have our proper courses of study for the current year, but we also want to project what we think the student is going to take next year. So we like to use that term anticipated or projected. We then like to break out with an asterisk any services that the student might be doing within the 1 year's time. And those services are actually measurable annual goals. If we have 3 measurable annual goals, we're going to have 3 services within that actual transition grid. We need to make sure that every single measurable annual goal in the IEP is represented as a service. And that's a shout out to our related service professionals. If we have a student that gets speech as a support, we want to make sure that speech is represented as a service as well. In addition to services in the actual transition grid, we also have things called activities. And activities are usually 1 or 2 things that we think the student might be able to do in a year's time, such as researching four-year colleges and universities. It shouldn't be something that they're doing daily. It should be something that they do once, twice, during the IEP term. So we want to make sure that we always remember that our IEPs need to be individualized. We might have some statements that are those cookie cutter statements there, but the IEP in general should be specific to that individual student. So now we're going to jump into the best practice piece for alignment. And alignment, again, is making sure that we ensure that there's that common thread, that alignment that goes through the multiple sections within the IEP. Aligning these sections of the IEP is very crucial to ensure that you have a valid and meaningful IEP. So the first step there is to make sure that we're always referencing the either initial evaluation or the most recent reevaluation report. And those summary of findings from the evaluation or the reevaluation report should be referenced in the present levels. We don't need to necessarily make a big copy and paste from the evaluation or the reevaluation report, but we can copy certain sections there. Nobody wants to read a whole wall of text that's 5 pages long from the evaluation or reevaluation. But we want to make sure we have some of that school psychologist information in those present levels. Taking it a step further, we always talk about our special considerations. Anything that's marked yes in this section should be thoroughly explained in those present levels. These considerations must be either addressed by a measurable annual goal, specially designed instruction, or a related service. So let's take communication, for example. If the student has some concerns in communication, that box is going to be checked as a yes, and then chances are they might have speech and language services there, which is addressed with a related service and a measurable annual goal. Any box that's checked yes, we want to make sure that we talk about in the present levels. We also have talked about needs. We mentioned this many, many times earlier in the presentation, but the needs determined from the present levels must be met with either a measurable annual goal, specially designed instruction, or a related service. 9 times out of 10, your needs are going to be met with a measurable annual goal. If you have 3 needs, again, you're probably going to have 3 measurable annual goals. You can meet a need with specially designed instruction or a related service, but again, chances are you're going to have a measurable annual goal if you have a major student need. Then we can talk about aligning things with transition. We talked about earlier how all measurable annual goals must be represented as a service in the transition grid. And that also means that each post-secondary goal in the transition grid must have at least 1 service as well. They have to be aligned that way. The courses of study must also align with our post-secondary goals. For example, if you have a student that's going to go on and do a post-secondary track to go to college, the courses that they should be taking should be aligning with that goal as well. If we have a student that's going to go on to college, we want to see that they're taking those classes there. That prepares them for the college experience. When we're talking about our measurable annual goals, we also want to make sure that the measurable annual goals should be based on the needs listed in the present levels there. Each measurable annual goal must be represented as a service in this transition grid, again, if the student is age 14 or older. So when we finish up alignment here, we want to make sure that we're specific. We have to make sure that we don't assume whoever's going to read that IEP knows the student. The general rule of thumb is our present levels are going to drive a baseline, that's going to drive a need, that's going to have a goal, and that's going to progress monitor. And that cycle repeats year after year. That's how we get that common thread to go through the IEP alignment phase. So this is just another example of how things can be aligned. We start with our present levels, baseline that gives a starting point. Then we determine what a need is. Then we have our measurable annual goal and our progress monitoring. To see what that looks like with an actual student, let's take a look at our friend Marcus. He has difficulty with spelling, capitalization, grammar, and punctuation. So the student has a need of improving written language by using a consistent strategy for proofreading and self-correcting of errors. The measurable annual goal talks about giving consistent use of a strategy and spelling check of his choice. Marcus will write and review his writing to include 80% correct spelling, punctuation, capitalization, and grammar on 5 out of 6 randomly selected short writing assignments. And notice that we have that baseline of 60%. Once that goal is implemented, the IEP team is going to progress monitor. And we specialize that by saying the progress monitoring will occur twice a month via the use of a brief checklist to review punctuation, capitalization, and grammar for the first 4 sentences of any random selected writing assignment. That's what it looks like in real terms for our friend Marcus. And we have one more example for our other friend here. And we're going to talk about scoring basic on a foresight in math. There's errors in algebraic equations. Currently scores 13 on algebra foundation probes. This is where we're currently at. That's our present levels. So the team determined a need that we need to improve our skills with algebraic concepts, including solving equations and inequalities. And that boils down to a goal for Caroline where we say, given a biweekly Algebra Foundations curriculum-based assessment, Caroline will solve equations and inequalities, increasing her score from 13 to 22 correct answers per 5-minute time period for 3 out of 5 consecutive probes. And how this boils down to our progress monitoring, their learning support teacher and Caroline will chart a number of correct answers on each algebra assignment. That's how it all aligns there. You can see that common thread going through each section there. To wrap stuff up, I'm actually going to draw your attention to a link here, and I'm also going to bring up the document that we're going to reference here. It's the IEP alignment and best practice review. So I'm going to stop my share of this document here, and I want to open up my next document, and I want to start to share on this one here and walk you through what this looks like. So we're going to view this full screen, and we're actually going to look at it this way here. So we have a document here that's going to be a supporting document for you to check out. It's called the IEP Alignment and Best Practice Review. The best way to utilize this document when you write your IEP is to write down what the student needs is from the actual present level section. So if they have a need in math, if they have a need in writing, if they have a need in behavior, we're going to write that actually down here. Then we want to make sure that we address this in the present levels. Did we talk about math in the present levels? Then give yourself a check there. Chances are, if we have a specific student need, it's going to be represented as a measurable annual goal, specially designed instruction, or related service. We want to make sure that we can reference one of those. So you would write down if we had the math, we talked about in our present levels, and then we had a measurable annual goal for math. We would then, if the student was of transition age, also reference that as a service in the transition grid. So you list all your needs here and you make sure your present levels and your measurable annual goals are lining up. And if we are transition age, that we're listing that in the actual transition grid. To take it a step further, when we actually look at our present levels there, we want to make sure that we're referencing either the evaluation report or the most recent reevaluation. You can give yourself a check. Then we have to make sure that we have some assessment information. If they're transition age, transition assessments, progress towards current goals. Very, very important to list that progress. We're going to look for all yeses here. Then we jump down to functional performance. If the student has behavior concerns and they had a functional behavior assessment, an FBA, go ahead and list that information there. Any other type of assessments there on social skills, behavior, communication, those type of things. We don't necessarily need all of these here, but if we have those concerns, we want to make sure that we're seeing those in the actual present levels there. Also about adaptive functioning, any related service providers as well, and then if there's measurable annual goals, listing that progress on the goals. We also want to make sure that we have our pieces for transition that are aligned. Did we have transition assessments? Did we make sure that we interpreted those assessments there? And is there baseline data to see what this actually looks like in terms of those measurable annual goals? And do we have evidence that those assessments are updated each and every year? Then we scroll down to our transition services. This would be considered the transition grid. If the student is going to a career and technical center, do we have the CIP zip code listed in that grid? And again, this information is in our transition best practice review that we had. Then we want to make sure that we have our 3 post-secondary goals represented: education and training, employment, independent living. If that student is 14 or older, we want to make sure that we have agency involvement as well, making sure that those goals occur after high school, making sure that we check our box for yes, and if we have evidence that those post-secondary goals are updated annually. And then the last piece here that we're going to focus on is our actual goals and objectives. And we want to make sure that our goals and objectives have a condition, a student name, that clearly defined behavior, and that 3 levels of performance criteria: how well, how consistently, and how often we're actually doing that. So we're going to stop our share here. That's an example of what that looks like. We're going to go back in to our PowerPoint here. We're going to go back and share our screen. And make this full screen one last time. So again, that supporting document can be found by visiting this URL here. It's called the IEP Alignment and Best Practice Review. We want to make sure you check that out. And then we always want to wrap up here and making sure that we understand that those needs need to be aligned throughout the entire IEP. And we want to make sure that we look for that common thread. Again, present levels, transition grid, measurable annual goals, or specialized instruction and related services. That's going to align everything there together. I always put my burrito there because I'm looking forward to having one after I finish this training here. And I just want to invite you to give me an email or give me a phone call if you have any questions or concerns. And I truly appreciate your time. Many, many thanks, and you all take care.